SMS is the most powerful marketing channel.
Stronger than ever.
The best and most effective personal communication channel.
The trials and tribulations of verification.
And we don't have all the answers.
How do you ratchet up the value of every message?
Finding that happy medium is in text.
Okay, welcome back to the State of Business Texting podcast. As always, I am Zach Kunkel, and I'm joined by Mrs. Caitlin Long.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back.
And today we are going to be diving into a hot issue in the global messaging industry, which is all about fraud. Ooh.
Uh-oh.
It's a little scary. So we are going to be talking about all about fraud, and we're going to dive into a 3-letter acronym, AIT, artificially inflated traffic, demystify like what that is, what is happening in the industry. So you're definitely going to want to stay tuned.
Yeah, and I think we're going to start out also with a little bit more context of what fraud even is in the messaging space. Right, Zach?
100%. And to help us kind of go through this topic, to be our guide, we're joined by an expert, Mr. Simeon Coney of ENEA, if I'm right. And Simeon is currently the Vice President of Business Development, and he's had a brilliant career across product management and strategy as well. But I don't need to talk about him because he is here. So Simeon, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you're doing in the messaging space.
Thanks very much, Zach, Caitlin. So yes, I've been working in mobile messaging now for, in fact, actually over 20 years. We've been helping keep people safe across the world, across a whole aspect of mobile messaging. I've been working in telecoms for that 35 years now. So really helping operators build out networks from the very early days of mobile infrastructure, and fixed mobile networks as well, spanning right across the globe. So yeah, I've seen quite a few areas and evolutions of today's topic of fraud.
Yeah, and we actually, Simeon, you and I were on a panel recently at the MEF event in Miami, and we talked a little bit more about this with a larger group, but it may be helpful to our listeners if you sort of help set context of really just the trends and sort of what is messaging fraud from your perspective, sort of from where you sit in the ecosystem and the various problems that you're encountering in your role. I know from our perspective here, as the volume of messages increase and the velocity of change, also we see on the regulatory side and sort of the compliance side, we're seeing an equal almost pattern on the actual fraud side, sort of criminality, and also just the fraudsters trying to evade and get ahead of the curve on, beating what we've set up as best practices. So just talk to me a little bit more about what you're seeing from your perspective.
Yeah, certainly. So, really messaging fraud is an increasingly expanding area. It covers such a wide range of attacks and abuses. It started off where folks realized that, of course, every mobile device being connected to every other mobile device meant you could suddenly start to reach an increasingly large audience. So, not only as a perfect marketing tool, it could suddenly become this great tool to further reach more folks, perhaps with more and more unwanted messaging, but then potentially also with campaigns and engagements where there is sort of misrepresentation or misidentification of whom actually is engaging there. So mobile spam started off really just as being probably a large volume of bulk unsolicited promotional, but increasingly we're finding it now being used to engage people where there is a strong pretense to be somebody else. There's such a wide range of businesses now using mobile messaging to engage their customer base through such a broad range of identities that the fraudsters are seizing upon that and using that to try and impersonate those existing relationships in reaching people and pretending to be somebody else. The purposes of that can be really quite wide-ranging. It might be to gain information about someone. It might be to gain things or details like passcodes or PIN numbers to accounts to take over those accounts. It could be to try and lure somebody into buying goods or services or products that they haven't intended, or even, impersonating other parties, getting them to influence their actions and their behavior barriers there. So folks, I mean, unfortunately, it's really proven to be such an effective communications channel. The bad actors are now increasingly creating new techniques, new ideas, and new ways of using messaging to engage in their victims.
Yeah, it's a stark reality, right? So you did a good job of painting the picture of what is happening, why are they doing that? Obviously, they've got nefarious intentions in mind. Maybe you can talk a little bit about, you kind of started with where did it start? What are we seeing now? Like, what are some of the trends that are happening now within mobile messaging around fraud? Like anything that's happened or changed in the past couple of years?
So yeah, when we look at messaging fraud and the trends, I mean, firstly, I would say probably that one of the biggest drivers for an evolution of fraud has actually been the growth in use of messaging by brands and enterprises, in the way that, particularly over the last 4 years, it's been a phenomenal tool for them to engage their customers. The challenge, of course, is that fraudsters see that, so they jump on the back of that and they try and find ways to follow a similar engagement, to try and impersonate, in order to be able to engage those clients, those customers, and start to either gain information or potentially extract intelligence, or actually get them to buy goods and services, or gain financial information. But likewise, also, our phones are living in our hands throughout the day. So, there's a whole set of other additional engagements that consumers are faced with on their mobile phones. So, this can span things like social engineering, trying to encourage people to respond to an initial contact and reach out. And again, following a trend of creating a conversation that leads to either information theft or getting them to buy goods and services, or provide financial payment for something there. So, I mean, broadly speaking, we're seeing growth in both brand fraud and consumer fraud. That's fraud that is affecting the brand and their perception, and the customer's perception of their integrity for the brand there, as well as actually attacks against the consumers, as users as well.
Yeah. And maybe to give a little bit more illustrative examples would be helpful, talking through what do those individual use cases of fraud look like, so that we understand where we can position ourselves as providers to be able to better mitigate fraud for our customers, consumers, and businesses that we serve. So maybe one example. So we have phishing, smishing attacks, right? When you're looking at those types of attacks, maybe if you could help us understand what would be an example of kind of the fraud with consumer and the brand angle. Maybe another one I've seen in the news recently, and it's actually gotten a lot more attention. Wall Street Journal, I think, even picked it up, like pig butchering, for example. Terrible name, very, very violent name for a fraud trend, where basically you just become friends. The fraudster tries to befriend the individual end consumer, build a relationship with that consumer over time. It's a very, very conversational use case in nature for the ultimate ends of fraud. And that can occur over multiple different platforms, not just necessarily SMS and MMS type of messaging, but potentially also, in a walled garden scenario as well. But just a very specific example of fraud. So backing it up, and maybe, Simeon, do you have other examples you could help our listeners with to better understand what is happening today in the space?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, starting off with actually the example you gave there with pig butchering, I mean, that's a great illustration of long-term invested fraud. They really want a conversation going there. This isn't about a single click hit, that's it, you're done and it's over. This is about building up, as you say, a relationship with the victim to be able to then move it into all sorts of ranges. So, whether it moves it into a financial transaction, as is the case with, stocks and shares and pig butchering, or whether it be other forms of sort of social engineering attack. But yeah, those are sort of the long-term, long-game consumer frauds there with that conversation. Looking more at the sort of the brand fraud, yes, you mentioned phishing, smishing. There are certainly sort of the types of attack that are designed about immediacy and urgency. Sort of your package is held up, you have to click here to release it, or your account's it's been locked. Click here to make an action. So those are the things that's designed to get people to do something without too much thinking. And certainly the guidance I would say to anyone that is providing a legitimate service is always ensure the customer can firstly understand your identity. So when they open up that message, they can see who it's from, and where possible, it's immediately start to trust that. Use the same identity in all of your interactions with customers and all of your conversations. Make sure that any website links that you provide there are, again, clear and unambiguously yours. Always make sure customers have a way of being able to find out your contact details. So, if somebody is unsure, actually the best course of action is to have them initiate it. Make sure that they can go to your website, check it out, and then click on the links to get that same level of action, and try and avoid anything that, again, creates an urgency that potentially fraudsters could also adopt. So we've got that as the first type of brand attack. But then we also see other cases where it's associated services. It's not just necessarily the brand itself. It might be, as we've seen, things like, package delivery scams. Somebody has made a purchase and they're now saying, hey, this is being held up or it needs to be redelivered. So sometimes thinking through that whole chain of customer interaction, and again, thinking through how that can be helped. So, provide customers proactively with tracking links. Make sure that they know how to get that type of information from yourself. Or, if there's appointments, give them clear links yourself on your own services. So, we can see that it's thinking through that whole customer engagement, whole customer conversation at every point, saying, how can I ensure my brand and my integrity is continually visible to that customer?
Yeah, and that's a great point that you make on what to do with knowledge of what fraudsters are doing. And so to kind of more directly tie it back, right here on this podcast, we've been talking about best practices, the evolving standards in messaging. And so as a industry thought leader and a very active participant in the messaging ecosystem, we're constantly advising customers as to how to best ensure deliverability with their messages. One of the points of, I would say, consternation for some of our, in particular, retail and e-commerce customers is sort of the treatment of link shorteners in the ecosystem. But I think that sort of your statement there and the anecdote that you just provided is a very specific example as to the why behind some of the restrictions around link shorteners, for example, or public domain link shorteners, and why it is a best practice in some cases to include the entire link with the all of the URL visible so that the individual engaging knows sort of where that's going. And so it's not always the best solution, but there is sort of the why behind that best practice, which I think is really helpful to illustrate here, understanding that the best practices that are evolving actively alongside the fraudulent tactics that are in the market today as well.
Exactly that. Yeah, I mean, we absolutely understand why link shorteners are attractive. You save characters, you keep things so short and punchy. But what we often don't think about is, okay, well, what could somebody else do utilizing that same thing to impersonate me? So all of that money I spent on building a great website and the domain associated, I don't benefit from that when I'm using a link shortener. And in fact, anyone can use that same link shortener and pretend to be me. So yeah, keeping things like your own domain there, it means that a customer can be educated to say, trust this domain, treat with suspicion, not to say it's bad, but treat with suspicion anything that is unfamiliar there.
Before we move on, let's hear a quick word from our sponsor.
Each time the Earth circles the sun, 2.1 trillion text messages are sent through space. But of those, how many make a true difference? This year, we're going on a quest, a search to find the rare senders who've mastered the delicate balance of channel strategy and who found ways to massively improve life on this planet. Are you one of these rare creatures? See award prizes and rules at bandwidth.com/texties.
So, Simeon, I'm going to take us down a different route. We've talked about brand fraud. We talked about consumer fraud. And I would say putting this new kind of acronym, AIT, that tends to be 100% in the brand fraud. You're trying to take advantage of an enterprise in a certain way. But for those listeners who haven't yet heard that acronym, AIT stands for artificially inflated traffic. And it's, I would say, Simeon, maybe you would disagree, but I would say it's one of the newer forms of fraud that's been made really popular from Elon Musk a few years ago, acknowledging that Twitter had millions of dollars taken from them through this scheme. And so, Simeon, maybe we can start with maybe you can just start with explaining what actually is AIT.
Yeah, so AIT, as you say there, Zach, it is a new type of fraud. It's interesting in that it's not typically visible so much to the consumer. So unlike the other examples where, there's often media reports and people are able to, see these things themselves on their phone, AIT is something that happens more within the messaging ecosystem and is a little bit more invisible to the user, but unfortunately is very, very visible to really any brand and enterprise that is using A2P messaging there. So what AIT is, as you say, it's artificially inflated traffic. It's effectively messages that were not created by a legitimate user for a legitimate invocation or consumption of service. Probably the easiest example on this to illustrate it is exactly as you say, the Elon Musk tweet there, which is to say that people were generating one-time passcodes in Twitter that he felt were not legitimate Twitter users. So we often hear about bots on Twitter, and our first thoughts are that those bots are creating tweets. But those bots can also be used for other things. And in this case, they can be used to generate new password reset requests or new login requests with those OTP messages, all of which ends up generating a message. Now, the question, of course, is why are they doing that? And this is then when we need to really sort of take that step back and go, well, actually, messaging is this global connectivity. And there's actually a lot of money and cost associated with delivering messages. We tend to think of things as, from a consumer basis of unlimited texting packages. But the reality is sending messages to other parts of the world can get quite expensive. And this is where AIT comes in, because if I've got an army of bots under control, I can use them to generate messages to anywhere in the world. And I can actually gain money as a result of every single message being generated and delivered there.
Yeah. And I think just keying off of one of the words you use there, global, I think is the key word. If we have listeners that are predominantly or solely working within the confines of maybe the US or Canadian messaging markets, this won't necessarily be as large of a risk to the business. However, if you were operating in any kind of global enterprise and you have locations or business outside of the US and Canada, I think this is where you start to see this become more of a risk, where you're seeing this, to your point, escalate outside of the US and Canada. Not saying that it's not a risk here for our enterprises. However, we do tend to see it more exacerbated after you leave the confines of such a consolidated market that we
absolutely.
have here.
I mean, so the advantage, yes, in North America is that, you could lock down your service to say, I really don't want to contact anyone outside of that +1 dialing area. As soon as folks do start to open up, then yes, effectively at that point, you're opened up to the entire world. And, the characteristics of messaging in other regions has been that there's been some very significant changing in pricing and also in some of the relationships there, which has really driven this growth of AIT. I mean, really, it's something that has actually gone through a very, very rapid growth over the last 2.5 years there. And in part, it's come through to being driven by exclusivity agreements between mobile operators and their terminating aggregators. So it used to be that any terminating operator, may have 5, 6, 7 different routes into their network. But to simplify this and to make it easier for them to manage, they've been moving towards having a single relationship. Now, the upside of that, of course, is easier to manage. But what it means now, though, is that the control of the price point becomes such that there's a temptation to start increasing the cost of that. And in fact, we've seen so many markets where the prices doubled and doubled again and doubled again over a very short period of time. And again, bringing that back to AIT, that means that there is now more cost or more money flow in that connection. And thus, every fraudulent AIT message that's generated can earn that fraudster more revenue. And in fact, I mean, to put some numbers on it, last year alone, there's an estimated $1.16 billion spend on this type of fraudulent traffic. So, we are talking quite large numbers here. I mean, in fact, the view is that it's actually almost 5% of all international A2P traffic is actually AIT fraud generated.
Yeah. And so, Simeon, essentially what we've talked about with AIT is for these fraudsters, there's money to be made by inflating traffic using bots to do things like two-factor authentication, one-time passcodes. And what I would be led to believe is that essentially the fraudster is working with someone in the value chain and they're in cahoots with them. Somehow they're getting money. Is that correct?
So yes.
Or am I wrong?
This is really then when AIT gets very involved, because it's understanding that value chain is critical there. Often people assume that the mobile operator where the traffic is getting terminated is the guilty party. And in fact, that's typically not the case. Sometimes the operator may be an unknowing accomplice in this, in that the traffic is flowing through their network. But normally what we're seeing with AIT is it's either then going to something called like a virtual number out payment. So somebody has leased a range of telephone numbers inside the operator, because this traffic has to go somewhere. We're not all faced with thousands of unwanted messages coming into our phones. So sometimes, yes, it's going to a range of telephone numbers that are under control of a third party, and they get paid for every message delivered. But the other part of this is that sometimes the messages are actually dropped or trashed before it even gets to the operator. So as you said, Zach, it's about that ecosystem chain and understanding who is in that chain, because typically the person doing that traffic trashing may be in collusion with the folks gaining the revenue from the AIT there.
Interesting. So when we're looking at how to combat that, and not just AIT. So we've talked about a few different things, but since we're sort of ending here and we've talked about how our best practices are evolving to account for additional strategies or methodologies that individual fraudsters are using, what are we doing? Maybe what aren't we doing? I know this is a loaded question, so
indeed,
take it how you want it.
The first piece of advice is make it hard for fraudsters to be able to generate something in bulk automatically, but that doesn't put too much of a barrier for your legitimate users. A great example is like a capture form. If somebody is saying, hey, send me a text message, it might be a helper link, it might be a one-time passcode, anything that generates a message. If it's going to a low risk number range that then fine, just let that go straight through. But if it's starting to go internationally, maybe prompt them with a capture, ask them to click on pictures of traffic lights or bicycles. If a service that enables people to generate a message, then again, think about how frequently they can do that. Start to look at things like, can they do that from anywhere in the world? Are you looking at source IP address for folks using your services? Is that typically your customer base? Also, your CSP, your CPaaS partner can also help provide levels of protection there potentially, by helping control spend to known high risk destinations. or looking for anomalous levels of traffic to unusual destinations for your account. So yes, there's a range of capabilities, both sort of in-house and with your CPaaS partner, that a brand can use to help reduce their risk and their exposure to this type of fraud.
Yeah, and I think that's an important call out there, and you hit on it at the end. All of our listeners practically, I think, are brands and enterprises who are using messaging to communicate with their customers, right? Whether it's patients or potential buyers of products, or again, just their existing customers. And I think an important takeaway for them is, as you're listening and learning about fraud, you need to understand what your provider or your messaging partner's holistic fraud mitigation strategy is.
So, Simeon, thank you so much for joining us. I would maybe pass it to you on any last thoughts. And also, when our listeners are wanting to engage more with any of your content or the thought leadership content that you've created, any final thoughts, and also how to engage with you and how to wrap their arms around any of that content? And I'll pause here. Sorry, this is like if you wanted to give like a LinkedIn, or if you have like a website that you want to point people to, this is sort of where you would, or feel free to do that. Yeah, personal plug.
There's a vast set of information and knowledge resources out there. I mean, certainly on the ENEA, ENEA.com website, we have white papers and webinars where we talk a lot more about this AIT fraud that we've been discussing today. Likewise, your CSP CPaaS partner has a great resource. And I think, Zach, you nailed it. There are always cheaper solutions out there. If you're buying based on price, you are increasing your risk. What we see with mobile messaging, just like any other service, whether it be, sort of financial services or banking or delivery engagement or IT, there are whole domains of fraudsters out there who know how to exploit that. So choose a partner who will keep you safe, keep you protected, and that will give a better experience for your business and a better experience for your customers. We're creating so many great relationships here now between brands and customers. Let's build on that and keep that stronger.
Yeah. And as a CPaaS provider and a CSP in the market, we are happy to talk to anyone and cover more questions after the podcast. Please reach out. But for today, that's a wrap on our episode. And next time we will be back again with Brad Roldan, taking it all the way back to the beginning. Flash forward, to talk about more predictions for what's coming in messaging. And in the meantime, don't forget to check out our full State of Messaging report and info on the Texties, which are our own awards for excellence in messaging. That's all at stateofmessaging.com. Thanks so much, Zach.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Caitlin. And thanks so much, Simeon. I appreciate it.